Welcome back to Journey to XRP. Today's video needs to be handled carefully because it sits right at the intersection of speculation, interpretation, and verifiable facts. There's a lot of noise circulating right now about Ripple's escrow, institutional involvement, and what may or may not be happening behind the scenes. Some of it is interesting, some of it is plausible, and some of it is impossible to verify. Our job here is not to blindly accept or reject any of it. It's to think clearly. The reason this topic matters is simple. XRP's escrow has been misunderstood for years. Most people still treat it as a giant pile of supply waiting to be dumped on the market. That narrative has been repeated so often that it's become accepted as truth, even though very few people stop to ask why the escrow was designed the way it was in the first place. Recently, a figure known online as Lord Belgrave resurfaced with a series of statements about Ripple's escrow and institutional planning. He claims to be a former City of London banker involved in crypto for many years and suggests that the escrow was never intended to represent loose corporate ownership waiting to be sold into the open market. Instead, he frames it as something far more deliberate, a supply mechanism engineered around long-term institutional readiness. Before we go any further, transparency is critical. We cannot verify who this person is, we cannot confirm his background, and we cannot independently prove his claims. That doesn't automatically make the information useless, but it does mean it must be treated as context, not confirmation. Analysis starts with caution, not excitement. According to his framing, Ripple's escrow was designed with intent, locked supply, predictable release schedules, long-time horizons aligned not with retail speculation, but with institutional deployment. In other words, escrow wasn't thought of internally as inventory for selling It was thought of as future liquidity, reserved for systems that weren't ready yet. That distinction matters because it completely changes how you interpret XRP's supply mechanics. In this view, escrowed XRP was conceptually accounted for long before the public ever understood what XRP might be used for. Not publicly allocated, not disclosed in detail, but internally modeled as future liquidity for large-scale payment and settlement systems. The claim is not that XRP was secretly sold, but that it was mentally removed from speculative circulation years ago. Again, this is not proof. This is a framework being described. What makes this worth discussing now is timing. The tone around Ripple, XRP, and institutional language has changed. We're seeing more direct references to settlement infrastructure and long-term deployment. At the same time, Ripple's regulatory posture has matured significantly compared to where it was years ago. When systems move from preparation to deployment, ambiguity tends to fade. If long-standing non-disclosure agreements were ever part of institutional planning, they would not last forever. NDAs expire when systems go live, not when speculation peaks. That's an important distinction. Markets often assume that silence means nothing is happening, when in reality, silence is sometimes required until something is ready. But here's where we need to slow down. None of this means escrow is locked forever. None of this means institutions are guaranteed to use XRP at scale. And none of this means price has to react in a specific way or on a specific timeline. Those leaps are where analysis turns into fantasy. What this does suggest is that the old narrative, 100 billion XRP equals permanent suppression, may be too simplistic. Supply design, intent, and usage matter just as much as raw numbers. And when you start viewing escrow as a strategic tool instead of a dumping mechanism, the conversation becomes more nuanced. That's why this video isn't about hype. It's about reframing assumptions. In the next section, we'll move forward and examine institutional accumulation claims, what is reasonable to believe, what crosses into exaggeration, and how to separate quiet planning from conspiracy thinking. That distinction is where most people either gain clarity or lose credibility. Let's keep going. Now let's move forward and deal with the claim that's making the most noise. Institutions are accumulating XRP quietly while the public remains unaware. This idea keeps resurfacing, and it needs to be handled with logic, not emotion. First, let's separate what is reasonable from what is exaggerated. It is completely normal for institutions to plan quietly. They don't broadcast positioning in real time. They don't tweet entries. They don't explain strategy to retail. So when people say institutions are stacking XRP behind the scenes, that statement by itself is not outrageous. It's how institutions behave across all markets. Where the problem starts is when that reasonable behavior gets turned into a conspiracy narrative. This is where voices like Jake Claver often divide opinion. When someone says institutions are accumulating and implies the public is being intentionally kept in the dark, the framing shifts from analysis to implication. Markets don't usually hide things out of malice. They operate on incentives, regulation, and timing. If an institution is accumulating, it's usually because the asset fits a future use case. Exposure is being planned ahead of deployment. Disclosure isn't required yet. That doesn't mean price is being suppressed, and it doesn't mean a dramatic reveal is guaranteed. This is why it's important to stay grounded. Quiet accumulation does not automatically lead to explosive repricing. Many assets are accumulated slowly over long periods without dramatic short-term impact. The effect shows up later, sometimes much later, when usage or demand becomes unavoidable. Now, let's connect this back to the escrow discussion. If you accept even part of the framing described by Lord Belgrave, again framing, not proof, then escrowed XRP being treated internally as future liquidity would naturally reduce how much supply institutions expect to interact with on the open market. That alone would influence planning, not price guarantees. But here's the line we cannot cross. Claims like, nothing in crypto offers this level of certainty or specific four-digit price targets are not analysis. They are belief statements. Markets do not offer certainty, especially not in advance. Anyone telling you otherwise is either selling confidence or misunderstanding risk. It's also important to understand incentives. Public commentary often blends genuine belief with engagement motives. Strong language spreads faster. Extreme claims travel further. That doesn't make the speaker dishonest, but it does mean the listener has to apply filters. A balanced interpretation looks like this. Institutions likely plan ahead. Some may hold XRP exposure already. Disclosure follows regulation, not speculation. Price does not need to react immediately. Anything beyond that moves into assumption territory. This is also where expectations get people into trouble. When investors hear institutions are buying, they expect instant validation through price. When that doesn't happen, frustration builds. And frustration leads to bad decisions, selling too early, overtrading, or chasing confirmation later. The smarter approach is to focus on process, not headlines. Institutional involvement is slow, procedural, and boring. It doesn't feel exciting when it's happening, and it feels exciting only in hindsight. So instead of asking, are institutions secretly buying XRP, the better question is, what conditions would need to exist for institutions to actually use it at scale? Because usage, not accumulation rumors, is what ultimately changes market structure. That's the bridge we need to cross next. Now let's move forward and talk about why XRP keeps getting evaluated differently from most other crypto assets, especially when the conversation turns to infrastructure, leadership, and execution. This is where a lot of emotional arguments fall apart. Most crypto debates focus on decentralization as an ideology. But institutions don't operate on ideology. They operate on accountability, delivery, and control over outcomes. When banks or large financial entities commit capital, they want to know who is responsible, who can make decisions, and who can fix problems when something breaks. That's why leadership matters more than people want to admit. On the Ripple side, you have a clearly defined structure. Executives like Brad Garlinghouse and Monica Long operate the company like a business, not a social experiment. Decisions are centralized at the product level. Even if the ledger itself is decentralized, that distinction is uncomfortable for some crypto purists, but it's exactly what institutions are used to. Contrast that with ecosystems that struggle to coordinate. When responsibility is spread too thin, execution slows down, roadmaps drift, promises stack up, and institutions lose patience. They don't want 10 competing visions. They want one clear direction. This is why XRP often gets grouped into a different category altogether. It's not trying to be everything at once. It's focused on specific problems, payments, settlement, liquidity, and integration with existing financial rails. That focus is deliberate. You can disagree with it, but you can't ignore it. You're also starting to see this acknowledged quietly by people who were previously dismissive. Even within Ethereum-heavy circles, some commentators have admitted that XRP may be better positioned for certain outcomes. especially if markets turn risk off or if regulation tightens. That's not because Ethereum failed. It's because different assets serve different roles. Figures like Vitalik Buterin and Joseph Lubin have built something incredibly influential, but Ethereum's strength is flexibility and experimentation. XRP's strength is focus and execution. Institutions tend to prefer the latter when real money is involved. This is also where comparisons become misleading. XRP is not trying to replace everything, it's trying to fit into existing systems and improve them. That's a very different ambition, and it leads to very different timelines and price behavior. Another factor people underestimate is patience. Ripple has been operating for over a decade. That's ancient in crypto terms. Most hype-driven projects don't survive that long. The ones that do usually evolve into infrastructure rather than speculation vehicles. And infrastructure is boring until it's essential. That's why XRP doesn't move the way people expect. It's not chasing narratives, it's waiting for relevance to become unavoidable. That process is slow and it frustrates traders who want constant action. But slow processes are often the ones institutions trust the most. So when you hear people argue that XRP is old, centralized, or boring, what they're really saying is that it doesn't fit the speculative cycle they're used to. That doesn't make them wrong, but it does mean they might be looking at the wrong yardstick. The real question isn't whether XRP wins an online debate. The real question is whether it fits into the systems that actually move money. Now that we've looked at leadership and execution, we can move forward and examine the concrete progress being made, partnerships, regional adoption, and why places like Japan keep showing up in this story. That's where theory turns into evidence. Now let's move forward and talk about evidence, because this is where narratives either stand up or fall apart. One reason XRP keeps resurfacing in institutional conversations is simple. Progress is actually visible, even if it's not flashy. Instead of chasing headlines, Ripple has focused on regional integration, regulatory alignment, and real partnerships that take time to mature. Japan is a perfect example. For years, Ripple has been quietly building relationships in Japan's financial sector. That didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen for social media engagement. Japanese institutions are conservative, compliance-driven, and slow to adopt new infrastructure. If they engage at all, it's because the technology fits their long-term framework. Ripple's work with Japanese financial entities, including banks and securities firms, isn't about hype cycles. It's about building rails for stablecoins, tokenized assets, and credit infrastructure on the XRP ledger. That matters because these are exactly the areas institutions care about as they explore blockchain-based finance. This kind of progress doesn't show up as instant price appreciation, it shows up as stickiness. Once infrastructure is embedded, it's very hard to remove. Systems don't get swapped out every year, they're chosen carefully and maintained for long periods of time. That's also why accelerators, grants, and developer programs matter more than people think. They're not designed to pump price. They're designed to ensure that when institutions are ready to use the network at scale, the tools already exist. That's a very different mindset from speculative crypto development. Now let's connect this to institutional DeFi and yield. Institutions don't enter crypto just to hold assets and wait. They look for ways to put capital to work. This is why platforms building compliant yield mechanisms, whether through lending, collateralization, or tokenized instruments, are gaining attention. The idea of assets like XRP being used productively rather than sitting idle is far more attractive to institutions than pure price exposure. This is where projects like Flare come into the discussion, not as hype, but as an extension layer. The concept is simple. If institutions are comfortable with the underlying asset, they will eventually seek yield opportunities around it. That's not speculation, that's standard financial behavior. Another important shift is privacy. Institutions need compliance and confidentiality. They can't expose full transactional details every time value moves. Ripple's roadmap toward privacy-preserving tools, including zero-knowledge proofs and confidential multi-purpose tokens, directly addresses that need. This isn't retail-focused innovation, it's infrastructure-focused. When you step back and look at all of this together, regional adoption, institutional tooling, yield infrastructure, privacy layers, a pattern emerges. XRP is being shaped for a future where blockchains are not experiments but components of regulated financial systems. That future doesn't reward speed, it rewards reliability. This is also where expectations need to be reset. None of this guarantees price explosions. Infrastructure adoption is slow. It often feels underwhelming right up until the moment it becomes unavoidable. And by then, positioning is already done. So when people say nothing is happening, what they usually mean is nothing is happening fast enough for me. Institutions don't share that timeline. Now that we've grounded this discussion in real-world progress, we can move forward to the final piece: how all of this fits into the broader market cycle, liquidity conditions, and why 2026 keeps coming up in serious conversations without turning that into a promise. That's where we close this out properly. Now let's move forward and close this out with realism, not excitement, because this is where most people either stay grounded or talk themselves into bad decisions. A lot of what we've covered points in the same direction. Institutions move slowly, deliberately, and with very different incentives than retail traders. That's why the idea of a clean, repeating 4-year crypto cycle is being questioned more seriously now. When ETFs, regulation, stablecoins, and tokenization enter the picture, timelines stretch. Adoption becomes procedural, not explosive. That's why voices like Matt Hugin talk about a longer grind rather than dramatic boom-bust cycles. Institutions don't rush. They approve products, test exposure, hold multiple meetings, and only then allocate. By the time they're fully involved, the story usually feels old to retail, even though it's just beginning in practical terms. This helps explain why XRP often feels out of sync with expectations. People are waiting for fireworks. Institutions are building plumbing. Those two things don't happen on the same schedule. And when liquidity starts coming from institutional channels instead of speculative bursts, price behavior changes. Moves become steadier. Volatility compresses. Progress feels invisible. That's not a sign that nothing is happening. It's a sign that the market is maturing. Now, it's important to say this clearly. None of this guarantees outcomes. Ripple does not control global finance. XRP is not destined to replace everything. Not every roadmap item will succeed. And not every institutional experiment turns into large-scale adoption. Anyone telling you otherwise is overselling certainty. What is reasonable to say is this: XRP continues to be positioned for a specific role: regulated payments, liquidity, and settlement infrastructure, at a time when those topics are becoming more relevant, not less. That positioning may or may not be rewarded by the market in the way people expect, but it does mean XRP should be evaluated differently from pure speculation assets. Another hard truth most people avoid is patience. Long-term narratives don't reward constant trading. Overtrading, chasing headlines, and reacting emotionally to every price move is how people lose exposure to assets they actually believe in. That doesn't mean never sell. It means understanding why you hold something in the first place. If your thesis depends on short-term price action validating you immediately, it's fragile. If your thesis depends on infrastructure, adoption, and long timelines, it requires discipline. That's really what this video has been about, not secret knowledge. Not guarantees, not price targets. It's about understanding how different types of capital behave, how narratives evolve, and why some assets feel quiet right before they matter, if they ever do. Before we end, I need to be very clear. Nothing in this video is financial advice. This content is for educational and informational purposes only. Markets involve risk. You should always do your own research, consider your own financial situation, and make decisions based on your own risk tolerance. There are no guarantees in investing, only probabilities and personal responsibility. If you take one thing away from this discussion, let it be this: don't confuse slow progress with no progress, and don't let certainty, either bullish or bearish, replace clear thinking. That's it for today on Journey to XRP. Stay patient, stay skeptical, and stay focused on the long game.